since you were invoked.
Thanks. Two things, if I might. First, and I enjoyed your presentation very much. First, I agree with you about the distinction between someone following God's commandment, as it were, as being religious and not necessarily as being moral. But if you also say that, or grant, that the writers of the Bible were good moral teachers, then, so to speak, the teachings of the commandments of God become coextensive with moral teachings. And so I wasn't drawing that fine distinction when I was referring to moral behavior being conducted, if you will, in the context of a religious tradition. Secondly, I have never claimed and do not claim that a religious tradition is necessary for moral thought. I'm expressing the empirical point that I'm skeptical of the possibility of developing a moral tradition or a moral philosophy even outside of the context of these. And I think the burden of proof is on witnessing the success, if it should ever come about, of a purely secular ethical tradition. So I do want to emphasize that that's an empirical claim, and I'm entitled to empirical skepticism about that possibility.
Is it a skepticism about the motivation to be moral, or a skepticism about the capacity to make and justify claims about morality?
It's the latter. It's about the possibility of even developing self-consistent moral claims.
But then in that case, okay, so it's not a question about getting people to be moral, but coming up with a systematic series of ethical propositions. But in that case, go back to your first claim. When you say that the biblical writers perhaps had some deep moral insights.
Which you claim, which you acknowledge.
Correct.
Yeah.
But what would make them deep moral insights was that there's this independent system of morality with which their views happen to coincide. In other words, the claims that they're making are not moral because they're making them. They're moral because there's this coherent system of morality which they happen to reflect. We find reflected in the Bible. Otherwise, and here you get the Euthyphro problem from Socrates. Remember, in the dialogue, Euthyphro is going off to prosecute his father for murder. And Socrates says, why are you doing that? And Euthyphro says, well, it's the pious thing to do. So Euthyphro says, Socrates says, so tell me, what is piety? Euthyphro says, well, piety is what the gods love. In other words, something is pious because the gods love it.
Uh-huh.
And I was assuming when you described your first view that that's not what you were saying. It's not moral because you find it in the Bible, but rather these biblical writers had sufficient moral insight to take these moral propositions, which seem self-evident or derivable from other higher propositions, and include them in their stories. Otherwise, you're stuck in Euthyphro's problem that if it's pious just because the gods love it, then the gods could have loved something different, and then that would have been pious, and then the gods fall into irrationality and capriciousness.
Harvey, would you like to say something? Please introduce yourself.
Harvey Carton, UCSD. I wonder if you could comment on an issue that comes into society increasingly in terms of the legal system now, where the Supreme Court refers to things such as natural law. How does that fit in with all of the concept of an insistence upon a universal morality, which actually reflects a very strong bias of the background of the people who judge it?
Right. It depends what's meant by natural law. If by natural...
Not the Natural Law Party, I hope. Do you know about these people?
No.
The Natural Law Party that contested British elections. You know these people? Yeah, the superstring Lagrangian and all that stuff. Yeah, they believe in levitation. Gives new meaning to the term floating voter.
It's unnatural law.
They promise we'll be able to levitate ourselves if they win? Is that... Yeah.
Sorry.
If by natural law You could mean simply the laws of nature, namely laws that capture with generalizations the way things actually behave and predict the behavior of other items. In that case, it's perfectly consistent with Spinoza to see him as a natural law theorist about morality because, like the ancient Stoics, what is right and what is good is what is in accordance with nature. Sometimes that's meant what's in accordance with human nature, namely that what will cause human nature to flourish. And in our case, what would cause us to flourish is the acquisition of knowledge, and especially a knowledge of our own place in the natural scheme of things. If by nature, on the other hand, you mean that there's inscribed in the world some normative claims, that's a much stronger claim, and I think that might indeed be harder to justify. It's certainly impossible to justify on Spinoza's grounds. But usually the natural law theory refers to normative claims inscribed into nature, which I think is more dubious.
You already have the mic. Go ahead.
Sure. Adam Kolber, law professor, University of San Diego. As you mentioned at the end, it could very well be the case that you can be virtuous even if you're an atheist. But it seems like religion probably has some effect on one's level of virtue. It could make it higher, it could make it lower. It could be the same, but so there's this open question, and people have made comments throughout that might touch on that question, the empirical question of which way it does affect us, but arguably it's still an open question. So my question for you is, how we discuss this with each other is conveying information, potentially altering people's views. The question has been raised, do we do that respectfully, or need it not be respectful in some sense? And isn't it itself a moral issue how you communicate it, because it may have the effect of making people more virtuous or less virtuous?
Absolutely. First of all, let me say I'm sure I agree with Professor Roughgarden that very often religious beliefs are a good motivator to ethical behavior. It would be foolish to take issue with that empirical claim. And I entirely agree with you. And I think, again, Spinoza's right about one thing. He says often in his correspondence, I abhor confrontation. And when his landlady, who was a devout member of the Dutch Reformed Church, said, will I be saved in my religion? He says, yeah, don't worry about it. Right? In other words, if it's helping you to lead a good life and achieve the degree of happiness that's achievable in this world, absolutely. Spinoza denied the immortality of the soul. There's no such thing as personal immortality after this life. If virtue has any rewards, it's going to be in this lifetime, and it's going to be through the tranquility and peace of mind that it brings you. And to become confrontational would seem to be at cross purposes with the whole objective of encouraging others towards virtue.
So if it turned out that theism makes people more virtuous, you'd have this tough bind between sort of conveying true statements or statements that you believe to be true with this possible negative effect on their behavior, their lives, their quality of lives, their society.
Well, that suggests that they're equally good ways to become virtuous, and that's what I'm not persuaded of. It's if false beliefs are effective in moving people towards virtue, fine. But what bothers many philosophers in relying on false beliefs and the passions they generate to motivate virtue is that these are very unreliable and changeable things. Kant, I think, had a very clear view that if people are going to be virtuous, you want it to be grounded in something that is permanent and immutable, namely the dictates of reason, not our personal inclinations, passions, and hopes and fears.
Let's just take one question from Harry Croto, and then we'll have to move on.
Just a
we can
comment, really.
Do this later.
With regard to the Bible, and I'm not a big expert on it, but there are sections of it that I think today we would consider rather unethical to actually follow those particular recipes for how we should behave. The second thing is, I think people, again, I'm not an expert, but I read a bit that packs of monkeys, certainly within the tribe, and to some extent without outside, actually behave pretty ethically without reading the Bible. So, I mean, it's open to question, but so there are these two areas that I think make biologists, and me as well, as an onlooker on biology, very skeptical about some of the claims you just made with regard to things like secularity. You're skeptical, which is reasonable to be, that we can't behave in a reasonable manner to each other if we don't read the Bible. And secondly, that there are many things that I think are abhorrent, certainly to me, and to many people who may be even fundamentalist Christians, and particularly in the Quran, who have a real problem actually thinking that these are moral and ethically good things to do.
Thanks, Harry. There's a couple of points there. We'd like to get somebody later on to talk about that. The point you made about ethical monkeys, I think, needs a little bit of expansion. There's some really interesting stuff on that, and it can be pretty raw out there. The other thing about the language of the Bible, it occurs to me that the one that most people quote, at least in this country, is the King James Version, which was being written at the same time as the gunpowder plot was being hatched. And the language of that, which is so extraordinary and soaring, was actually put together by a committee of 58 people. It's about the only time that anybody's brought anything soaring in terms of language out of a group of 58 people. Until today, of course. I would actually like to use that prerogative to shift slightly. Based on what Steve has just said, it seems to me more natural that we actually go to Pat Churchland now and then come to Loyal Rue afterwards. Sorry to spring that on you, but if you could put your tennis shoes on.